Yeah, so some people, I think at my stage, kind of early in their careers, are going to maybe give you like, when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I was thinking, okay, could I just give a detailed kind of description of what I did in my dissertation research? Um, I opted to not do that for a couple of reasons. I am going to talk a little bit about the work that I did in my dissertation, but I also want to touch on some other kind of research that I do. But before doing that, I want to give you a lot of context about the kind of phenomenon that I'm interested in. And I'm doing that in part to give you the background, some substantive information that maybe might be interesting to you, help you understand why I do the research that I do, but also because if you're interested down the line in my research specifically, or you're looking for a future comprehensive exam or master's thesis advisor or something like that, I want you to know the kind of stuff that I can hopefully help guide you on. So I didn't want to go down too narrow of a path so that you can at least get to know me and the stuff that I'm interested in more broadly. So I'm titling today's discussion, I suppose, Civil Wars, civil in parentheses for reasons we'll talk about in a little later, violent groups and patterns of armed conflict. And again, this is kind of consistent with the kind of courses I'm interested in teaching: political violence, civil wars, and interstate conflict as well. So whenever I start talking about civil wars, or I tell somebody that I'm interested in civil wars, they always say, "Oh, well, you must know a lot about the American Civil War, right?" And I know something about the American Civil War, but remember too that civil wars are happening all over the world, and in fact, civil wars, according to some accounts, though I actually dispute this, are becoming the more prominent version of political violence in the world compared to, for example, wars between countries. Right? You think about, for example, the current ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which is classified as an interstate war, wars between countries. And one of the reasons why that was so shocking is because it just doesn't seem to happen anymore. Right? It just, especially with major powers doing those kinds of things. So the fact that interstate wars is rare should not take away from the truth that is that civil wars are still also very, very prominent in the world. So these are wars then that occur within countries. And although the United States has had their own, obviously, civil war, the civil wars themselves are a politically essential feature of many modern states. And so one contemporary example, of course, is the war in Syria, which started basically April of 2011. And this is a conflict that has involved multiple rebel groups fighting against the government at the same time, including the Islamic State, multiple Kurdish groups that have worked together. And obviously it has attracted international military attention as well. The Russians have been heavily involved. And the war is still going on. It's becoming one of the most violent civil wars in modern history. Another contemporary example, right, is the war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country that has been riddled with civil wars for decades, really. And the interesting thing about the war in Afghanistan is that the victors have switched sides quite a bit. So currently the Taliban has taken over, as some of you probably know. So they represent the current regime. This is not the first time they've done this. Right, this is the second or third time they've done this, but then they were ousted, and then they were a rebel group again, right? That they were then fighting against the government. But in Afghanistan as well, too, it does buck the traditional notion of what civil wars are, which we'll again talk about more in a second, because besides just the Taliban, there are also lots of other rebel groups that have been active in that country. And of course, once again, we do have this war in Ukraine where Russia has invaded, but don't forget that this was actually a war that started as a civil war. It's a war that started with separatist violence. There were kind of two rebel groups in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. And they actually kind of formed an alliance, as kind of a pro-Russian coalition of groups that wanted to effectively secede from Ukraine and possibly be part of Russia. The exact kind of goals have changed, right? But before Russia actually invaded a couple of years, a year ago now, or 2 years ago now, year and a half, I guess. Before that happened, there has been since 2014 or so separatist violence, which is a civil war. This is just conceptually like the American Civil War, right? These are groups that control territory that wanted to secede from the state, just like the Confederacy did in the United States. Now, this is kind of a question then that I like to pose to students in my international relations class, but in any class that we're going to talk about civil war, interstate war, and that is, what is war? And the reason why I ask this question is because we as political scientists, as I'm sure you've picked up in other talks, right, or your own kind of research, is if we're going to study something systematically, we have to be able to know it when we see it. But at the same time, knowing when we see it can be kind of complicated. If we're going to define what war is, so that we can, for example, make a list of all wars that have happened or something like that, conceptually, political scientists usually use a definition that's something like this. War is an organized and military force by at least two parties that reaches a minimum threshold of severity. And so there are a couple of really important features of what a war is. One is that it's organized. I'm bolding these terms and highlighting these features because they're important to distinguish war as a phenomenon from other political phenomena that may otherwise be important, but they're not necessarily war. And so one feature then is that it's organized, and that's meant to distinguish war from something like rioting, right? That might be perceived as disorderly. The parties that are fighting in a war need to be part of some kind of organized structure to some degree. But of course, what organized mean is of course subjective. The other piece of this is there needs to be at least two parties that are fighting against one another. And so this is meant to distinguish war from something else like one-sided mass killing or genocide. Again, this isn't to say that mass killing and genocide aren't an important phenomena in their own right, but it is to say that genocide isn't the same thing as war. It does not equate to war. Genocides can happen during war, but a war in and of itself involves two sides that are fighting against each other, whereas genocides, one-sided mass killings, usually involved one armed actor killing a lot of civilians, right, who are not armed or resisting to, right? The third kind of piece is that there's usually some level of severity, right? The exact threshold is usually arbitrary, but the point here is that war needs to meet some minimum level of severity so that we're excluding war from something like just low-level military force. So, for example, if the United States uses a drone strike and kills 2 people, right? That's an act of killing, but is that the same thing as a war? Probably not, right? It's very different from like World War II or the Russia-Ukraine war, right? And so there has to be some kind of minimum threshold of severity, but again, that threshold is kind of arbitrary. Some research uses a 25 battle death per year threshold. Many believe that that definition of conflict as something that maybe is less severe than war is still too low, right? On the other hand, the more commonly used operational definition of war has a minimum death level of 1,000 battle deaths per year. And some might believe that that's too high, or at the very least, everybody recognizes that that number is very, very arbitrary. Changing those thresholds sometimes changes our findings in research, and so there's pros and cons to that too. But again, conceptually, what I'm trying to get a point across is that if we're going to distinguish war as a specific phenomenon from something else, usually we have some kind of minimum threshold of severity. There are different types of categories of war. I was going to talk about kind of two today with a specific emphasis on the second one. But really the thing that distinguishes these two are that interstate war is war between two sovereign states, whereas civil war is a war between a government and at least one rebel group. So a non-state armed group that's fighting against the government, typically within their own borders. So this just kind of illustrates some patterns of interstate and civil wars since 1816 up until 2016. And there's a couple of interesting patterns we can see here. So the darker line, the dark green line, is the number of states that are involved in a civil war. And then the lighter green line is the number of states that are involved in interstate wars, so wars between or against other countries. And there's a few important patterns to note. First, we can see a couple of big spikes, right, in interstate wars here. And if you know anything about history, some of you are social science or history teachers, right? What is this? Right, this is World War I. Right? What's this? This is World War II, and then the Korean War, right? There's some other there's another spike in the 1970s. But another interesting pattern is that other than those spikes, it does seem that interstate wars, the kind of trend over time is pretty stochastic. In other words, the distribution over time of the countries that are involved in interstate wars seems to be fairly random, although, again, there are these kind of big spikes. The other kind of pattern that's interesting is this dark one. These are the number of civil wars. Here we see, interestingly, that throughout the 1800s, and even all the way through, let's say the 1960s, mid-1960s, there's a relatively straight kind of trend line. But then after the 1960s, right, we see a massive spike in the number of countries that are experiencing wars within their own borders, these civil wars. There was a decline in the late 1990s and 2000s, and since then there has been kind of an uptick. Anybody I don't know if anybody knows something about this period of history, but can anybody suspect why this pattern might exist? Part of this is, yeah.
Is it because of the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so that's one reason. So once we get to like the 1990s here, right, there might be an uptick in civil wars that are the result of conflicts that are happening in these new states after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But what about here?
Would that be the
Does it have to do with decolonization?
Decolonization and newly independent states, right? So that also led to this uptick in violence. Now, once things started kind of normalizing in terms of the number of states, like new states, right, weren't coming about as much in this period after the late 1990s, then we saw kind of a decline. But again, we've seen an uptick once again. But big picture, the other thing to see here is that, like I noted earlier, civil wars seem to be more common than interstate wars. And in fact, if you look at some data, you'll also see that civil wars tend to be more violent and oftentimes a lot longer than interstate wars as well. We see a war like the war in Ukraine and Russia, and we think, oh, this is going to last forever. But in terms of history, the war in Ukraine is actually is unusually long for interstate wars. Most interstate wars are actually fairly quick. And that's why a lot of scholars wrongly predicted in the beginning that contemporary conflict actually would only be a couple of months long. Okay, so before we get into civil wars, some of you know this because you've taken my IR class. Some of you might know this because you have taken an international relations, even an undergraduate class, right? But in case you haven't, I did want to give a little bit of international relations background. The kind of early version of international relations theory oftentimes revolved around power politics, right? And the big picture theory was called realism. Many people still subscribe to this view. It's basically a framework for understanding how especially great powers, right, interact with one another. But it does simplify the world quite a bit. So this is just a very super quick kind of primer. 4 major assumptions. The first is that the principal actor in international politics is the nation state. That's the most important actor. States are unitary actors, meaning we don't really care about all the stuff that's going on within the states. We just are going to pretend like states behave like people. They have kind of a drive of their own. Relatedly, states are rational. So, states as this aggregated actor seeks to maximize, the probability that they're going to get stuff that they want at the lowest cost possible, right? And then finally, the really, really important one is that states exist in a state of anarchy. The international system is anarchic. In other words, there's no supranational governing authority that can legally or with any authority arbitrate disputes between states. States themselves, right, exist in the state of anarchy, which doesn't necessarily mean chaos. It just means that there's nothing between states. There's no supranational government, right, to which states themselves have given up some of their sovereignty. That's different from what we might think of as like with relations within a state, right? We have a government and we give up some of our liberties, right, theoretically, so that, right, the government can protect our property, our interests, etc. Take political philosophy if you want to know more about that. But the idea here is, again, states exist in anarchy. And the realist view then is that international politics is fundamentally about each state maximizing its relative power or security. And it's those shifts in the international distribution of power in the system that leads to changes in alliances between countries and ultimately war between them. More specifically, right, rational states in an anarchic system take actions to protect themselves from threats because there's nobody else to protect states themselves, right? You can't rely on anybody else. You have to do what you can to protect yourself. Otherwise, you as a state will not survive. And so again, you don't have to take this view. This is just the realist view of the world. So if this is how we're going to assume the world works, then what is the best way to protect oneself as a state? Gain more power, right? One thing to know about me, I do like Star Wars. So there might be a couple of Star Wars references here. The story here is that states will ultimately try to seek more power, ultimately so that they can deter threats against them. If you're a really powerful state, then other states might not want to attack you. But when you as a state, right, see your neighbor gaining a lot of power, then you think, oh, if I don't gain power too, then they can attack me in the future. So I need to gain more power. I need to build up my military. And so this ultimately leads to a vicious spiral called the security dilemma that ultimately can lead to a situation of war. Sometimes we might, specifically preventative war. But again, big picture, I don't think there will be a test on this, right, Dr. Transu? But war in the realist view happens because there's nothing there to prevent it. That's the big picture takeaway, okay? There's another, again, general overarching theory about international politics that we call liberalism. This has nothing to do with, like, in the American context, conservatism versus a liberalism. This is something different. Liberalism, though, again, broad brush, is a theory that's a little bit more optimistic than realism. Right? International cooperation is possible. It's not as competitive as realists make it seem, but ultimately, they're going to relax the assumption that states are just unitary actors. Liberals in this context, right, believe that domestic politics matters too. The domestic features of a state can affect their behavior. And it's because of that liberals oftentimes lean towards this interesting phenomenon in international politics called the democratic peace, which they say realists can't explain very well. The democratic peace is a thesis that although democratic countries do fight in wars, they almost never fight wars against one another. I challenge you to think of a war between two strongly democratic states, right? And what that means, though, in the liberal view is that those regimes that are within states, the features, the norms, right, the institutions, that kind of stuff can affect international behavior. And that's stuff that realists ignore. Okay, I have a thing in the chat. I want to make sure. Oh, Palpatine reference is good. Yes. So again, big family, two kind of families of theories in international politics and views on international conflict. This is going to come into play later, I promise. So that's, broadly speaking, the kind of underlying theories that we use to explain things like wars between states. If you've taken my international security class or international politics class, you know that we're very unsatisfied with those answers, right? But they are foundational to kind of theoretical thinking about international politics. The literature on civil wars, though, tends to be a little bit different. There are tons of research questions about civil wars, right? It used to be, especially once there's new pattern emerged of more and more civil wars happening in the world, that the fundamental question is, well, why do civil wars happen? Why do they start? And research on this issue started off with kind of macro level factors, right? So things like maybe the really impoverished countries are more likely to have civil wars, things of this nature. Or there are domestic and group level political factors, things like maybe certain ethnic groups are excluded from power, and that increases their kind of grievances and makes them more likely to rebel against the government. And then other approaches focus more on individual incentives to rebel, right? In order to have a rebellion, you have to have people who are willing to join the rebellion, right? So that you can create an organized movement that might be strong enough to start a conflict. So I also like the Lord of the Rings. So the kind of old theories about civil wars usually revolve around grievances. That's kind of the big family name of these theories, is grievances. And again, grievances simply means that, like, you have to have people angry enough about something in order to get them to resort to violence to try to overthrow the government and make things better, right? Big picture, broad brush set of arguments. And so if you've seen this movie, this is from the Two Towers, the second movie. This is when the wizard Saruman, who's kind of like in cahoots with the really, really bad guy, he goes out into the wildlands of Rohan, and he starts mobilizing all the wild men, was what they're called, all the people who are kind of living out away from the cities and stuff. And he uses these kind of appeals to foment their anger. He says, you know, the horsemen, the people who are in Rohan, the country of Rohan, right? They drove your people into the hills to scratch a living off rocks, and then the crowd gets all angry and they start calling them murderers, right? And Saruman then tells them they need to take back their lands that they stole from you, right? Burn every village, right? So he's mobilizing people by fomenting their grievances. He's appealing to the things that made them angry, that made them aggrieved, that made them lose access to power in this, you know, kingdom, whatever. And there's a couple interesting points about this, though. One is that the idea here is, of course, in order for people to be willing to commit violence, there has to be enough anger and frustration about something. And usually that can take the form of political exclusion, economic marginalization, things like this. But also that narratives around those grievances are usually constructed by leaders who want to foment a rebellion. So we did see a little bit of this in one of the articles that I had sent you all for today, and that was the article that's interested in sitting, well, if, you know, grievances maybe do matter, let's think about different kinds of ethnic groups and what are the features of ethnic groups in different countries, and see if we can find common patterns of the ethnic groups that ultimately decide to come together and create a rebel movement to try to overthrow the government or something like that. And the using data, statistical analysis, some theory, right? If you kind of remember, they thought about groups in terms of those that are included as well as those that are excluded from government. And what they find using some statistical methods, right, is that the kind of common features across the ethnic groups in the world that tend to rebel are those that are excluded from power. This is probably unsurprising. really, really big ones. So maybe this means something like ethnic groups have a lot of support to draw from in order to create a strong rebellion. And it oftentimes happens against governments that are led by an ethnic minority. If you know anything about, for example, the like conflict in like Rwanda that happened in the 1990s, this is a good example of this. So, or South Africa as well, right? So you have an ethnic minority that has oversized power, for example. So these are kind of common features, common trends that seem to be correlated at the very least with conflict. And they're part of this broader set of evidence in the world that suggests that the thing that foments rebellion is grievances, right? People have to be angry about something. Of course, there are critiques of this set of arguments. One is that people are angry about stuff all the time, and that doesn't mean that they always rebel. Of course, also, even in the same country, right, a group may be excluded or something like that for a long, long time, but that doesn't really help us explain when the war starts. But again, it's like a foundation. And certainly, I do believe that in order for rebellion to start, there has to be some anger. I told you, I alluded earlier to something that when I was an undergrad, I learned about a puzzle that made me just kind of walk away, and I was just kind of fascinated with this conception of a phenomenon. This is called the rebel's dilemma. So this is a different kind of perspective on why wars might start, why civil wars might start. I like to teach this, especially my undergrads, because it's an opportunity to get them engaged by offering them extra credit. So I'll explain that to you in a second. But the idea here is, let's say that I'm a rebel leader and I come up to your house and I say, I want to start a rebellion and I want you to join me. So let's simplify the world for a second. I say, look, if we win, the government's going to be better. We're going to have better healthcare, better education, right? All of these like public goods that the government should provide, we are going to do. It's going to be better for everybody. But we have to win. Will you join? You, as an individual who's being recruited, has two choices. Choice one is that you can participate in the rebellion. You can join up. And if you join up, the consequences are, if you help support the rebellion and they win, you get all of the benefits of this new government, right? The better healthcare, whatever. Alternatively, you also are risking your life. Right? You could die in combat. Okay, choice two. You don't join. What happens then down the line if the rebels win and you didn't join? Well, you still get all that good public stuff. You get the new healthcare, you get the better education or whatever. But you're not putting yourself on the line. So any rational individual in a very simplified world should recognize this collective action problem and think, well, I'm better off free riding. I hope you win. I hope you rebels win, overthrow the government so I can get all this nice stuff. But I have no reason to risk my life. I'm just going to let other people do that. The problem is that everybody faces that same incentive. And if everybody faces that same incentive, why do rebellions start at all? This is a fascinating puzzle. That was the thing that really got me thinking about rebellion as this really interesting political phenomenon that I wanted to understand more deeply and explain. Some of you might know something about what a collective action problem is. If you do, and it's okay if you don't, does anybody know what one way to solve this problem is?
Are you referring to like small groups to minimize the collective action problem?
Yeah, so small groups, right? Of course, this doesn't help you in a rebellion, though, because you need to have a big group.
Sure.
But that can be a solution for sure. Sorry.
Yeah, how about other students? Any thoughts?
You, as the rebel leader, need to provide something.
Incentives. Yeah.
Incentives
Yeah,
only to the people
Right.
that participate. These are called selective incentives, right? So wages, stuff. If you join the rebellion, you also get to like loot. And if you loot, you get to keep that stuff, right? But if you weren't participating, you don't get those benefits. So this gave rise to this other kind of perspective on why civil wars might start, which is that civil wars start in countries where there are lots of, for example, lootable resources like diamonds, like alluvial diamonds. This is a classic explanation for why the war in Sierra Leone started. But at the very least, at the group level, or I should say individual level, if in order for a group to mobilize, they have to have resources to pay in some way their soldiers, to incentivize people to participate with stuff that they would only get if they actually join the rebellion. And so this,
the Sudan right now, Sudan with all of the gold and the rebels, the 100,000 army of Al-Hadi, that's a great example.
yeah, that's exactly right. And so we're actually going to talk about Sudan in a second. So I'm glad you brought that up. But this is more of a what we might call a rationalist perspective. But the criticism of people who prescribe to this view is that, well, you know, again, everybody can be angry about something, but it doesn't help solve this problem. Even if you have lots of very angry people, that doesn't mean that they're going to mobilize, risk their lives if they have the option to free ride. So again, there are other answers to this question, but I'm giving you some big picture sets of theories to explain why civil wars kind of start. And incentives be by force. Yes, so another way to think about this is instead of raising the private benefits of joining, is you raise the private costs of not joining. In other words, you go up to the house and say, you can participate or I will, you know, kill your family, right? And so you're raising the cost then. So you're forcing then individuals into the movement. But if you take my civil wars class, you also might learn that that has downsides too. If you forcibly recruit your whole movement, who in the movement actually cares about your success, right? That can have long-term implications for the success of the rebellion, but that's a really good point. Okay, so this was one reason why I kind of assigned also this Humphreys and Weinstein article as a really famous article. I thought it was really useful because instead of trying to study macro level phenomena and try to find these patterns that people have theorized about, well, is it kind of greed that leads to civil wars, or is it just grievances? They looked at one civil war and they did intensive surveys to try to understand at the individual level, those who participated, why did they do so? And so they have all kinds of different kind of measures, right? But they base their arguments on these kinds of theories, right? Grievances, are they economically deprived, politically marginalized, socially alienated? Did they join because of selective incentives, right? Did they join because they got money to participate? Or did they join because they felt social pressure to participate from their friends? You know, there's some kind of community structures, those kinds of aspects. And what was, I think, insightful and useful about this article was not just the rich, deep data that they used, but that they found kind of all three of these sets of arguments have some support. And what that means is the kind of old literature on why civil wars start has oftentimes viewed these theories as competing explanations for why wars might happen. But I don't know that that's the case. This evidence suggests that they maybe work all together. Ultimately, to have a rebellion, you have to have people who are willing to participate, and people participate for lots of different reasons. And some of them might interact with one another too, right? If you're not economically deprived, you might be less inclined to take selective incentives rather than continuing your normal day job or something like that. The idea here is there's lots of reasons why rebellions might start, and maybe it's not useful to kind of take different theories and can pit them against one another. So again, that's kind of a broad brush overview of the literature on why civil wars in the world start. Another strand of literature is about why then these civil wars end. This research thinks about, you know, what is it that can bring rebels and governments to the negotiating table, the role of mediation, the role of international peacekeeping, the design of peace agreements and negotiated settlements, right? How these wars come to end. And this is also a very interesting area, but it's not the thing that I do a whole lot of research on, right? But I'm happy to like explain more about that if anybody's interested. I situate my research search more in these other two veins, specifically number 3. So we have theories about why civil wars start. We've got research on why civil wars end and how they end, but I'm more interested in the stuff that happens during the civil wars. You know, some people have studied things like, why are some civil wars longer than others? Why are some more intense than others? Why do third parties intervene in some conflicts and they don't in others? What explains variation in violence against civilians by either the government or rebels, right? How effective are certain different kinds of counterinsurgency strategies? Why do some governments or rebels control territory in different ways or to different extents? Another really interesting area is rebel governance. If you know anything about the Islamic State, one thing that was made it such a capable rebel group was that it took control of territory, and then it also like provided social services just like a state government would, right? And so it was because of that, right, the group like collected taxes, and then that helped finance the rebellion so that it could continue its, you know, terrorist behaviors. But that is not an uncommon phenomenon. Rebels oftentimes take control of territory, and then they try to govern it as if they were the state for a lot of different reasons. Again, big picture, this is a whole set of literature that I'm really interested in. This is the stuff that happens during the wars. And I'm also interested in how that stuff during the wars affects post-conflict politics. So people who study that might study like, how do we kind of promote democracy after civil wars? How do we prevent a conflict from restarting, right? Some scholars study like the integration politically or militarily of rebel groups, and if that's an effective strategy to, again, reduce kind of conflict recurrence. Local level peace building strategies, all this kind of stuff is a whole other kind of set of research, right? So there's tons and tons of literature, academic literature on civil wars at all stages. Okay, I bolded the stuff that I'm particularly interested in, but that doesn't mean I don't know something about these two. So one example of the research that I've done that kind of links the two, but was mostly about stuff in the conflict process, the stuff that goes on is during conflicts, is research on pro-government militias. So that was the third article that I had kind of suggested that you read for today. That paper was actually my master's thesis. So you all can do the same thing, right? Publish that, whatever, when you get down the line if you're interested. But so pro-government militias are interesting groups because they're often involved in civil wars. They're also prominent outside of civil wars. But something like 80% of civil wars in the world also have included one of these groups too. Pro-government militias are not essential features of civil wars, but they're interesting because they're non-state groups, like rebels, that fight on behalf of the government rather than against it. And so governments will use these kinds of groups for all sorts of reasons. And there are strategic benefits that governments have when they use them. So for example, they might mobilize a pro-government militia, which might take the form of like a paramilitary group. Dictators sometimes do this in order to deter coups from happening. This isn't always an effective strategy. If you know something about Sudan, you know that strategy failed miserably for the dictator, al-Bashir. Sometimes groups, though, in the context of civil wars, will create kind of local civil defense groups, right, to kind of hold territory in towns and villages, to fight against rebels when the state can't really fight in that space. So it also offers this benefit of having more troops that are fighting against the rebels, right? And also these groups tend to be associated with like the really severe mass atrocities. And that's because governments can employ these groups to go and do the really, really bad stuff, and then they can keep their own hands clean. They can say, oh, well, it wasn't us, it was this other group that we can't control. So again, a classic example of this would be the Interahamwe in the Rwandan genocide, right? The Interahamwe was the militia group that was fighting on behalf of the government, but they were the ones with machetes. Okay. This is a picture of another group like this called the Janjaweed. And this was a militia group in Sudan that worked with the government to commit a genocide in Darfur. Now, as you may have inferred then from the reading that I gave you, there is a downside to employing these groups. What if they get too strong? If you give them lots of stuff so that they can be a capable counterinsurgent force, that can benefit you in the short run because it can help you defeat rebels. But in the long run, it can be detrimental to state stability. Sometimes what might happen is the group itself, the pro-government militia group, wants then a stake in the post-war government. We fought for you, we killed for you, so we should get stuff too. You're also arming and organizing a group that if you don't give them what they want, they might then decide they're going to now turn into a rebel group in the future. So you might be laying the groundwork for a future war. And that can happen even with these groups that you think are your most trusted allies. In Sudan, for example, if you followed the stuff that happened last year, and is actually still ongoing, it's just kind of left the news with other things going on, is that there was a dictator. He's been in power since the 80s. And he had this group, he supported the Janjaweed militia. And then after, about 10 years ago, I believe, 15 years ago, he reorganized the Janjaweed into what was called the Rapid Support Force, kind of paramilitarized it, made it a little bit more official. And he did that in part because he wanted to have this extra military wing that could be used for counterinsurgent purposes, but also because he knew that the official military of Sudan didn't trust him. And so he, as a dictator, wanted to prevent that coup from happening from the military. So he wanted to deter them by having a very, very loyal force, right, that would vow to protect him no matter what. Well, what happened? The leader of the Janjaweed, then the leader of the RSF, this guy, Hemedti, ended up joining with the military to overthrow the dictator. The problem is now, after a few years of bickering over what the transitional government will look like, in part because this guy wanted lots and lots of power in the post-war government, whereas the military didn't want to integrate this paramilitary force. Now they're fighting, right? The kind of transitional government collapsed, and now both sides are at war with another, and we've had, it led to a few hundred deaths in the first couple of weeks, and it's still going on today. So there's no real government in power in Sudan right now. We have two forces, the official military and this paramilitary group, right? This pro-government militia, what used to be a pro-government militia, fighting it out now for power. And my prediction is that that's going to continue to go on until one side is just outright defeated. The problem is that this guy kept getting more and more powerful because the regime had to keep buying him off. So that's a whole other story that we can talk about. But again, this is an interesting kind of type of group that's involved during conflicts that can affect post-conflict stability. Another thing that I'm really interested in are the wars that actually involve multiple rebel groups. So these multi-party conflicts, right? Conflicts where at least two rebel groups are simultaneously fighting against the government at the same time, actually make up the majority of at least low-level civil conflicts in the world. And that trend has been pretty consistent over time. These conflicts are interesting, though, because they tend to be more deadly, longer, right? Harder to end, and far more complex than wars that involve just the government against one rebel group. And this is kind of the traditional conception of what a civil war is. But, we can see those kinds of trends if you know something about Colombia, had a very long war against the FARC and the ELN and some other leftist groups. Burma has been in a state of conflict with lots of ethnic rebel groups since the 1940s. Sudan also has had recurring conflicts with multiple rebel groups fighting against the government. Iraq is the same kind of situation. right? We have this all kinds of different places. Syria, of course, is another one. The reason why they're so complicated, but also why they're interesting to try to study, is because we have to understand not just the rebels why the rebels are fighting against the government, but these rebels themselves also have to make decisions about how they're going to interact with one another. Sometimes, if you're a rebel group fighting against the government, you might also decide, oh, there's this other rebel group that's competing with me for power. I need to go to war against them too. And the benefit might be you can eliminate them from the battlefield, but on the other hand, you have a common enemy. So wars between rebel groups in the same civil conflict is a whole other interesting phenomenon. Sometimes rebel groups will just choose to ignore one another, but that usually doesn't last. It's not a sustainable strategy. And then the final strategy, of course, is rebels can choose to cooperate with one another. They might remain separate, but they might form an alliance to try to overthrow the government together. Those kinds of that kind of phenomenon is interesting to me because when you think about rebellions, if you imagine the leaders of two rebel groups coming together and deciding to talk about if they're going to cooperate to overthrow the government, they have to have a long-term plan. And so if you can imagine two rebel leaders coming and sitting at a table, can you imagine one of them sitting and saying, okay, let's cooperate, let's work together so that we can overthrow the government, and then you get to be in power after we win? This does not happen very often. So the puzzle of cooperation itself between rebel groups was very interesting, and that was the impetus of my dissertation work. I won't go through all of the findings and stuff in my dissertation, but I'll just outline the kind of things that I did. I was interested in not just why rebel groups cooperate, but what the alliances themselves looked like. If you know something about alliances between countries, you know that alliances look very different. The structure of NATO is different from, for example, the informal cooperative arrangement that the United States has with Israel. Different alliances have different mechanisms. They're designed in different ways. But the research that had been done on cooperation between rebel groups usually just kind of said, okay, sometimes rebel groups cooperate, sometimes they don't. So that extra variation in what those alliances actually look like is completely unexplored. So I wanted to know what they really look like and how can we systematically categorize the features of different cooperative arrangements between rebel groups during multi-party civil wars. And ultimately, if there is variation in how they're designed, we want to understand what the pros and cons are, what the benefits of different designs are, what the downsides are. And if they have some benefits or some alliances are functionally better than others, then we have another puzzling question, which is, right, why don't groups always choose that type? And finally, I examined this question of if rebel alliances happen and they can affect things like how conflicts end. Do the different types of cooperative arrangements between rebel groups affect the kinds of peace agreements and the stability of those peace agreements, as well as negotiations during the kind of immediate post-conflict phase? Again, another Star Wars reference for those of you who know something about the Rebel Alliance. So to study those questions, what I did was I put together a new data set called the Characteristics of Inter-Rebel Cooperative Arrangements data set. I basically looked at all civil conflicts, low-level civil conflicts, and big ones, where there were at least two rebel groups fighting against the government at the same time. And I coded, actually the 1,100 observations is actually an underestimate because I'm completing it now and expanding the data set. But lots of observations. And so I tried to code not just whether groups were cooperating, but also what those cooperative arrangements looked like. So I have this very large data set on the features of different rebel alliance agreements, what they look like for 230 different rebel groups and combinations of those groups within the same countries. If you're interested in kind of what I found, I'm happy to talk about that later. Okay, 1998-ish, that's a great question. I said 1989-ish, because I use this as a starting point, but sometimes conflicts that, for example, started before 1989, but ended after it, I also included those too. So I started with 1989, but if a conflict, right, was ongoing as of 1989. I also like went back farther and observed the whole of that conflict, right, and the relationships between those groups prior to 1989. So I actually have data set on rebel groups that go back as far back as 1970 in some cases. But I had to kind of set a cutoff point because it's just impractical to do it, for 200 years. Okay, so then to finish my spiel about at least my research interests, the other kind of stuff that I'm working on right now are, I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in this phenomenon of rebel governance and ultimately the implications of that for state re-governance. So I'm doing this project with some co-authors that's asking this question of when rebel groups try to take control of territory and then they try to govern, right? They set up their own judicial institutions, their own courts, right? Their own taxes, their own other kind of governing structures. How does that affect the civilian experience and how civilians view the state and one another? And we actually are finding something very interesting. We have done this large project. It's still in the early phases. We're still analyzing the data. But we did these experiments called field experiments in contested areas in India where there's been a long-standing conflict against Naxalites, which was a leftist communist group. And the way that we went about this is you can't really ask somebody like, oh, how much do you trust your neighbor? Because then they'll start thinking about trustworthiness and trust. So what we wanted to do was try to measure this without them knowing what we're asking them. So what they did was we had enumerators do this. It wasn't me on the ground. We had them play games. And they played games actually kind of like that collective action problem thing that I showed you earlier, where they would like be given some money and then they kind of can donate some, right, with the expectation that they might get some back from their neighbor, right? So there are different kind of setups, but we use that as a way to measure things like trust. And one of the things that we're finding, which is kind of interesting, is that in the areas where rebel groups had like governed, or at least recently governed, people tended to actually trust one another more compared to in places where the state has had really long-term, strong kind of control, independent of Naxalite violence. And that's really interesting. We have some reasons why we believe that might be true. But that's kind of what we're finding, but it's going to be a longer term project that I'm really excited about. I'm also working on a project about these institutions called gacaca courts in Rwanda, which were transitional justice mechanisms to try to prosecute perpetrators of the genocide. But one interesting thing that my other co-authors and I are finding is that using this kind of really cool data on like actual prosecutions that these courts are doing, we're finding that they don't seem to actually they're not really being used as a tool for justice. They seem to actually be being used as a tool for repression, that the authoritarian regime in Rwanda is using to basically repress Hutus. In other words, these courts are being used for persecution rather than prosecution. And then a final research project, which we just sent off after getting to get hopefully published now, is about international conflict and the role of right-wing populism in democratic countries. And we find that leaders who are right-wing populists and use this kind of rhetoric in democracies tend to initiate militarized interstate disputes more often. As I mentioned earlier, I'm also interested in quantitative methods as an approach. I've done some kind of research on quantitative methods, but also I just use it as an applied tool to study the world. So I'll wrap up though then with a controversial statement. This is something that I've been thinking about for a little while as somebody who, again, is trying to understand the world of conflict, civil wars, interstate wars, etc. I don't necessarily have an answer to this, but since you're all smart, maybe you can help me. We differentiate wars between countries and wars within them conceptually. We study them using different theories, right? We try to explain them and the phenomena that occur within them in different kind of silos, right? I kind of told you at the outset that my interest is in civil wars, and I like studying interstate wars too, but I identify more as a Civil War scholar, whereas somebody else might identify as somebody who's an expert in interstate wars and might not know much about civil wars. So we study them differently. But are they that different? This is actually a question that I think if I pose it to most academics, they would get very mad at me. So maybe I won't do a whole lot of writing on this until hopefully I have tenure someday. But let's kind of work through this, right? What is it that's supposed to make them different? Is it the actors involved? Well, we did distinguish between wars between countries and wars within them as wars that are between two sovereign states versus a war between a government and a rebel group. But let's think about what that means really. What is a sovereign state? Does anybody have a definition of what sovereignty means, or at least what a state is? The kind of classic definition has like three components, right? One is that there's territory, there's people, right? And borders around that territory, and some level of governance. But I was just telling you earlier about how rebels do this too. Rebels control territory. Rebels try to govern in that territory, right? The only difference between a rebel group that controls territory and a state, a sovereign state, is international recognition. But does international recognition, should that influence these actors' behaviors differently? Enough so that we should try to study wars between countries and wars within them as different phenomena? If so, the question really comes down to the only distinction is international recognition of entities as states or not states. Not whether they are, not their actual features, just whether the international community collectively decides, yes, you're a state, or no, you're not a state. And I don't think that should really necessarily drive our theory. Is it anarchy, right? Maybe anarchy doesn't exist within states, but it does exist between them. Well, I would argue, though, in the context of a civil war, right, rebel groups aren't listening to the laws of the land. Right? I think it's reasonable to argue that in the state of a civil war, in an ongoing civil war, there's no supra group entity authority within that state that can credibly enforce contracts, because the rebel group isn't going to listen to the government. So maybe that's the same. Civil wars are characterized by domestic anarchy. Okay, geography and territory could be a difference. So Robert, I don't know if you put that in there after I said, after I gave my explanation, but if so, we can continue to debate it.
There's a few things in the chat, just so you know.
Okay. Oh yeah, sorry. Let's see. Power. A state has institutions that can be maintained to keep its power and monopoly on violence. I just told you about how there are places in India where the state had no control. Rebels had the control, right? This is a good point. I'm not trying to shut you down, but this is an interesting intellectual debate, right? Another is, you were going to mention earlier that ISIS had the characteristics of the state, even though it wasn't recognized as one. Exactly. And again, that's not to make any normative claims. That's not my point. My point is simply that theoretically, when political scientists think about international politics and state behavior, the only thing that differentiates states from rebel groups that control territory is just international recognition. That's all. And that shouldn't differentiate how we theorize, per se, about the behavior of these entities. Could it be alliances? Well, I've also shown you that that's not the case. Not only do rebel groups cooperate with one another, but they will form very detailed alliances sometimes. They'll come up with these contracts, and delegate certain roles and create these leadership councils and stuff, right? Delineate power in different ways, just like NATO, just like interstate alliances. Are there true theoretical differences? Well, I've also kind of suggested that the foundations of our theories, right, about these different phenomena, or what some might consider different phenomena, are basically false dichotomies. Another theory, which again, my international relations seminar we talked about last week, was bargaining theory, right? The bargaining model of war, which is this really interesting idea that basically sets up this puzzle of war as one where if everybody knew everyone else's resolve, capabilities, willingness to follow through with their threats, there should actually be no war because we already know how they would end. But if that's the case and war is costly, that means that war should never happen. There should always at least exist a deal that groups can come to without going to war. We don't need to go into the details of that. Again, take my class if you're interested in learning more about it. But the point is, we can apply that to civil wars too. Right? In order for wars to end, the rebel group and the government have to fight it out so they learn information from one another about their capabilities and resolve. And it's only after they learn enough information that they come to a resolution. So I don't know, maybe these things are kind of the same.
Can I suggest one thing?
Yeah, please.
And I'm going to discuss this next week, whether or not we perceive certain types of violence to be legitimate or illegitimate. So if individual killing is reprehensible and goes against my moral compass, me killing somebody violates every belief that I have. But for some reason, if you put on a uniform, and going killing and crossing a border is considered legitimate and actually honorable.
Patriotic.
Yeah. Songs are written.
Yes.
Insignia. And one of the articles that we're going to go over is Warfare is Only an Invention, Not a Biological Necessity by Margaret Mead. So it's a very interesting way to... So the topic for next week is propaganda. And tying that discussion of propaganda to perceived legitimate or illegitimate violence, and tying it to the overall issue of propaganda and war. For example, message force multipliers that were something that the Pentagon did to vilify and present the Iraqi regime as a looming existential threat, and using certain people with insignia in generals in their uniform to create this war fever.
Yeah,
that's something that was employed by two fathers of public relations, Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, in World War I. So anyway, you'll have so
yeah, that's a really, really great point. I mean, that violence is the utility of violence is in the eye of the beholder, right? Or at least the meaning of violence can be reconstructed in different contexts. Also suggests that to kind of put this in the same framework of what we're kind of talking about, right? For some, violence is justified, and for others, violence is never justified. It just depends on the context, right? The United States fought a war for independence that required killing a lot of people, but obviously, like, the history, like, that is kind of vilified as this, it was kind of glorious violence, right? Because it achieved a national aim. But the same can be said of other rebellions, right? Rebellions occur because people support them. And that means that if people support the rebellions, they support the rebels' use of violence. And similarly, sometimes people live within countries where the government uses terror, violence, kills civilians, but they still support the regime because they think that it's justified in order to retain order or something. right? So the meaning around violence, right, can be constructed for sure. And that can be done by rebels and governments. And so the role of violence and war and the meaning around it, right, that also won't distinguish interstate versus intrastate war. So open it up now to anybody else who has another perspective on this, because is there anything else, like a reason why, like why these wars might be conceptually different? And I'm genuinely looking for an answer here, because it's intellectually difficult for me, because I think it's an interesting comparison to make, but I can't convince myself of the ingrained belief that I want to hold, which is that I like studying civil wars for some reason more than interstate wars. But I don't know why, because maybe they're the same.
Well, I was going to say that in a lot of times in civil wars, if you want to use the American Civil War as an example, the rebels view themselves as their own sovereign state. And when you look at them historically, you kind of have to, because if you don't view them as that, then I was going to say, but a lot of time in civil wars, the rebellions view themselves independently from the country. So it is kind of interesting to. I was going to say this earlier, but it's like these wars, we're comparing them, but they almost seem, if a rebellion views themselves independently, then isn't that just an intrastate war? It's like, it's kind of, the definitions there get a little weird at that point.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Go ahead, Elise. Is that how you say your name?
Elise?
At least you're still muted.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. Okay. I was just saying I'm probably completely wrong. But my previous sort of understanding between, is it interstate versus civil war? Interstate to me feels more about money and resources in a sense than civil wars do, because like, I don't know, just based on what I've seen, civil wars are a lot more about like rights, land, freedom, like sort of the abolition of things, while interstate seems more like there's some sort of, there feels like there's something else there, and it feels more like power and money.
Yeah, and I'm with you in that I want to believe there's something different, because it doesn't feel that way, right? But like, the war in Sierra Leone, rebels, the RUF mobilized largely in part, at least in part, because the rebel leaders could kind of guarantee control of diamond mines, and people could profit off of that.
Yeah, true.
Right? That's about money.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nicholas is the next person at the top of my screen, I guess, with the hand up.
Yep.
Which one?
No, you. I'm sorry.
All right, sorry about that. Well, anyways, so I was pondering a lot on this idea of sovereignty, because as I teach government and civics, it's like, all right, we got to talk about sovereignty. What is it? And to me, when I come up and think of sovereignty, and what David brought up, especially with the American Civil War, in which they set up their own legitimate government, it's almost like the South, right, felt like they were a sovereign nation and gave legitimacy to the Confederacy, right, and gave it to their own state, right? And I think that sovereignty really does have to do with that idea of legitimacy from the people that are there, right? But then it also has to do with international, recognition, right? So it's like this weird tiptoeing sort of thing. Like, and you think of like a nation like, well, it's hard to say it's a nation, right? Of Taiwan, right? And you think about those ideas of, well, are they a sovereign nation? Technically, no. With China, right? It's one state, two systems, right? But then you have, international, certain countries recognize Taiwan as a nation, and where do we set that idea of sovereignty? Is it just solely based off of what
Yeah.
other nations think, or is it also based off of what, is happening on the inside?
Yeah, and that's a great example, great insight. And what I'm sitting here and thinking is like, the question I'm trying to pose here is that if that line, that sovereignty line, is so fuzzy, when we as political scientists think about interstate wars and civil wars, should we be thinking about them using different arguments and different theories? And to use your example, I think, okay, well, let's say I wanted to build a list of wars, build a data set, right, of civil wars or something. And then I have another list of interstate wars. And then now let's say China invades Taiwan. Which list do I put it in? And that's important because then when I try to use it as evidence to support whatever theory I'm coming up with, right, I don't really know where it fits.
Yeah, do we put it in because of how the US treats it? Like one nation, two systems? Do we say, all right, is it a civil war because we treat China as the sovereign nation, but two systems, right? So we still kind of recognize Taiwan. That's where sovereignty gets real fuzzy, right?
Exactly. And then at a deeper level, the other question is, does it matter what list they're in? Should that list just be the same? Okay. Other Nicholas, Davenport Nicholas is next. The next hand.
I kind of think of it as two different things. So the first that comes to mind is probably scale. So in the interstate wars, I think that the scale is a little bit higher. There's a lot more people involved, a lot more countries involved in from what I see. I know that recognize that there are smaller wars and bigger wars. I just think that makes it a little bit more complicated when you have different countries involved, because then you have a clash of cultures, because there's different cultures that are basically coming together, as opposed to like a civil war. It's main. I would tend to think that they have a similar culture in the country because of like their geographical area. So the culture is probably very similar. So that's the way I would view that. And then like in a larger scale, from a military standpoint, like you're gonna have a different military strategy between it. And then politics wise, I feel like you're going to be taking the politics in a different realm, whether it's an interstate or a civil war. So I feel like that's kind of why they would want to separate them, because you're going to want to do different tactics, whether or not it's an interstate or a civil war, based on culture and scale.
Yeah, again, great ideas. I'll play devil's advocate. Your point about culture is certainly, reasonable, but remember that to the extent that obviously it's not a perfect overlap, but that cultural differences sometimes align with ethnic differences. Many wars, civil wars, start because there are excluded ethnic groups, right? So there is a culture, even if there's a similar national identity, right? There can be cultural differences within civil wars too. And in terms of counteracting these kind of wars, or like counterinsurgency versus fighting an interstate war, I'll say two things. One, I would argue that many states might conduct these wars in similar ways. I talked about pro-government militia groups, for example, as something that oftentimes is a feature of civil wars. You guys heard of the Wagner Group? This is a pro-government militia group that was fighting in Ukraine. And then, of course, what happened, right? This group got very powerful, started to threaten the regime, right? But it was a pro-government militia group. The ways that states fight these different wars also a lot of times depends on capabilities and terrain. But those things are not related to whether the war is an interstate war or a civil war, right? It's just geography and technology. So your points are great. This is an intellectual kind of debate. because it's a hard problem. I don't know, but I like what you're saying here. And Virgil, you had your hand up too.
Yes. I actually wrote down a couple of things. Going back to the brief portion of the conversation on China, I think that's very complicated. But the one thing that wasn't discussed was American ego, where yes, Taiwan is the China that we supported in World War II. Not necessarily mainland China.
Sure.
So I think our own ego and our own history plays into how we would view potential conflict there. But I also wanted to point out that the war in Sierra Leone, I think that would kind of fall into civil war as well as interstate war.
Interesting.
Yeah, I say that because I lived in Liberia for several years.
I remember you saying that, yeah.
Charles Taylor pretty much ran the war in Sierra Leone with arms and ammunition, the Blood Diamond trade. It was pretty much run outside of the country. So that one's more complicated. I think that one could clearly fall into both categories.
So I think what you're suggesting is that my question here also is implying, I think you're actually supporting my claim here, right? That line between interstate wars and civil wars can be fuzzy. I mean, certainly the Sierra Leone Civil War is not the only one where that we categorize as civil war, but it's kind of run by intervening forces too. Right?
Well, I would classify it in even more simple terms. The guy who gets shot, he doesn't care if it's an interstate war bullet or a civil war bullet. He just knows he gets shot.
Yeah, that's very true. I think you're right. Yeah. These are really good ideas. I don't really know what the kind of like time limit is, but like if anybody has any other kind of thoughts here, I'd love to hear them. Otherwise, we can move on to the next thing. Yeah, Dr. Chansu.
So this is a few things. Some of this is not, it's very interesting to think about. I also have that gut feeling that it's different.
I know. I want to believe it too.
And when they're going, I think it's hard to make that distinction. But the origin, and this goes a little bit to what Virgil was referring to, and also I wanted to ask you about Ukraine. But so here I'll say the simple thing. So the simple thing is that a civil war, at least some of the participants had claimed to be loyal before, whereas interstate wars, the French never claimed that they were Germans. They might want to influence Germans in certain ways. They might think that they have, ideas about what it ought to be like. Now, how that manifests, I don't know. I mean, I think it might be some of the reason for the greater atrocities is that there's betrayal. So now, if I may, just pre-associate a little bit things that came off that. So this is kind of a Hein Goleman's question about persistence.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, I'm very interested if the data comes with this. So if you have this a civil war where somebody was previously loyal said, no, this state is not working, so either we're going to kick it out of this territory or we're going to do regime change, right? I think Elise was talking about ideological, right? So like the Russian Revolution was, we're going to change our system. We're not going to change our borders. We're not going to change a lot of the administrative stuff, but it's going to be first, a parliamentary democracy, and then no, we meant communism, fake communism, but not Richard. But anyway, so one thing is where it comes from. So there isn't really a moment when the police could squash an interstate war. Now, whether you think the police are different from the military is, I mean, again, those they kind of fuzz into each other. So where it comes from, and Virgil is making this point about, you had to start training or equipping from somewhere, right? And that seems like it's something that's different. If you got pre-existing states, they can build up, build down these pre-existing militaries, but in civil wars, there was a military appeared that wasn't supposed to be there. So I was curious. I mean, one thing, again, picking a tree now, and I'm not a subject matter expert, but my impression of the breakaway regions in Ukraine is that they were fake. That it was basically pay, they're just, it's the Russians just convincing people to do it, and there is no homegrown. I'm putting that strongly, but in American politics, we talk about interest groups. There are a few real grassroots interest groups. That's like how the bill becomes a law, and people band together and they want to get something done. And then there's AstroTurf, which is fake top down, when a lobbyist or somebody has letterhead and starts gathering, but they don't care how much money they actually gather, because they just want to look like there's some popular thing going on. So I mean, my impression, and I'd be interested to know what we know about this, is that the breakaway regions in Ukraine were total AstroTurf, and there was very little real sentiment, like Elise was talking about, and that it's just kind of fomented from the outside. So one more thing. The other thing I was thinking about is this idea about international recognition. It might be interesting to go farther back to before there was such a thing. We were so interconnected. I mean, sometimes some rebel groups arrive because somebody, kind of like Monty Python, they say, "Hi, I'm your king."
Yeah.
Charge, and you're like, "No, you're not. We're a self-governing collective." And then what is that? That's that I would put in kind of a new category. That's almost like frontier or something. But I mean, you can go back to the Holy Roman Empire, and the Pope had this role in certain things, but you go far enough back and it's just, but I think that idea, I mean, you can go to pre-modern literature, and this idea of rebels, the Greeks are these little tiny city-states, but still there's this distinction between rebellions within the city-state and the city-states fighting each other, even though it's just tiny patches of land and sets of people. I don't know what to do with that, but it's so I'm just sort of riffing off Virgil and Elise and so on.
No, because these are all, everybody's thoughts on this are really interesting. I mean, I'll say a couple of things in response to a couple of points that you made, because you're pointing on something that, like, again, when I've been having this internal dialogue and when I've talked to other people about it too, again, I'm trying to like convince myself that they are conceptually different, that they're categorically different, right? And one of the better explanations I thought I had was what you and some others have suggested, which is, well, in civil wars you have to mobilize, and in interstate wars you usually have some kind of standing military already. Then I look at the data, and something very interesting about rebellions. The majority of rebel groups started off as breakoffs from the military, or they were created by other standing military force, or they were breakoff from another rebel group. And so in that sense, like, it does maybe work a little bit differently, but on the flip side of the coin, like, you might have a standing military as a sovereign state or something like that. But when you're ready to go to war, you have a mobilizing process that you have to do. And part of that involves, for example, paying salaries, right? Just like what we were talking about with, wages for rebels too. And so maybe there is still a difference there, but maybe they're not also as different as, the classic, Civil War expert or interstate war expert might believe. And so I think, that was kind of one thing that you said, and because I've thought that same thing. But again, the bigger picture point that I think I'm trying to make here is that, these are two, in some ways similar phenomena. And big picture, the question I want to know is, like, as scholars of political science who want to find patterns in the world and want to test theories about stuff, should we view these things as something different? And should we study them as completely separate phenomena? In other words, should I write my research article on civil wars versus interstate wars, or really is civil versus interstate war a control variable to throw into the model? Is it something that is categorically different between, like, they're totally different phenomena, or is it something that might have some effects on the margins or something like that, something we need to account for, but it's not something that's totally, they're not like the phenomena itself are not essentially different, and therefore maybe we shouldn't use different theories to explain them. But again, I don't know. I mean, I'm saying all this stuff, and yet next semester I'm going to teach a course on civil wars, just on civil wars, right? And Dr. Octay teaches a class on war and peace, and she touches on civil wars a little bit, but it's mostly about interstate wars, right?
Let's get Sarah.
Yeah, Sarah.
Hi, I put this in the chat briefly, and I wish I had a better response to your question. I wish I had the answer for you.
So do I.
But one of the arguments I would make is one of the key differences, at least it would seem, is that interstate conflicts often draw the attention of other states, and that can lead to international alliances, interventions. With civil war, it seems like there's less involvement, and especially with interstate wars, there's significant global implications. I mean, would you agree with that?
I hear what you're saying, but Syria has been a massive geopolitical conflict, right? The United States, for example, has supported rebels. There was a whole kind of debacle we talked about in my IR class last week about, Assad was using chemical weapons. President Obama set this red line and said, we're gonna use like direct military intervention if this happens again. And then it did happen again, and the United States didn't do anything about it, right? Or at least didn't follow through with that threat. Meanwhile, Russia, right, was clearly on the side of Assad, right? Lots and lots of airstrikes, killing tons and tons of people. And there were large kind of geopolitical consequences there. Wars that happen within countries also or oftentimes involve other kinds of powers, right? Other great powers that want to get involved. So think also about like the Cold War, right? If you know something about like Cold War history, you might know that the United States and the Soviet Union never went to war with each other, against each other directly, but each side was supporting and getting involved in civil wars all across the world, right? They were fighting these quote unquote proxy wars, okay? And so I definitely hear what you're saying, right? Maybe these interstate wars end up being getting more international attention, but that's partially because they just don't happen very often compared to civil wars. But that doesn't necessarily mean that wars are not the international other states don't get involved in other civil wars. Another reason, right, we also might see more about interstate wars too, is because interstate wars tend to happen in much of the global north, whereas civil wars are more likely in the global south. And Western media doesn't report on, right, countries that are not in Western Europe as much. So that's another kind of, it's just like a perception type thing, right? It would be the counter argument. But that's a good
That's a
point.
great point. Thank you.
Dr. Bolte, have you ever when you were in grad school and studying for your PhD, did you study Germany and Clausewitz?
Yes, a little bit.
Well, I asked because listening to you speak on the subject of civil wars, I can hear the Germany in there because it sounds as if you have a theory or belief that war could be described as prescriptive and formulaic.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, I believe war is strategic. It's a strategic tool, right? That states or rebels use to accomplish goals, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think I might agree with you. But yeah.
Okay.
But again, like the challenge here is it's an intellectual one. Because I want to know why these things happen, and the consequence ultimately of, let's say, siloing off these different types of conflicts and studying them in different ways might be that I'm missing a lot of important information out there if I'm just ignoring all these other conflicts just because the rest of the academic community thinks that there's something conceptually different. Maybe we can learn a lot about civil wars from studying interstate wars and vice versa. So they shouldn't be siloed off. And I think that's important as like we move forward in the political science study of conflict and peace. Yeah, Elise.
So this is a little unrelated, but also related at the same time. This feels like a past discussion I've had with the philosophy of science, specifically the philosophy of biology, in the sense that we categorize everything so like harshly and precisely when it doesn't always need to be that exact. And especially looking at evolution, that's specifically a hard topic, because at what point does one creature mate with another, begin to evolve into something like totally different? And so the main takeaway from that whole discussion is like, you can have these larger, like solid descriptions like cephalopods, but then it's still murky, like, because we don't always need such a solid definition for everything. So we can have that, like, this is generally what this is, but it can sort of bleed and mush in like either direction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think humans have this tendency we want to categorize things because we just have this innate like need to find patterns in the world. And science specifically wants to study a specific phenomenon, but then they have to define what that specific phenomenon is. So your point is, I talk about this in my other class when talking about how we kind of measure what war is too. Does anybody know what the definition of a hurricane is? Anybody who wasn't in my class?
I mean, living in Florida, I just call them water tornadoes.
Yeah, water tornadoes, sure.
Is it straight line winds above a certain level?
Yep. Yeah, so tropical storm, right, has to be at least 75 miles per hour winds. So a tropical storm with rotating winds, right, that where the winds are going 74 miles an hour, not a hurricane. Why? I don't know. Is Pluto a planet? I mean, yeah.
Pluto is a planet. I will stand by that.
All right.
And second, for the 74 miles per hour, is that because it's technically below a category 1, so there wouldn't be as much like harm done?
I have no idea why a 75 mile an hour hurricane causes categorically different amounts of damage from a 74 mile an hour hurricane or storm. right? So yes,
Yeah.
you're right. That like brings it below category 1. You're correct. But
Right.
why is 75 miles per hour the category 1? That's
maybe it's infrastructure. Maybe like this is just some like wild thing I'm throwing out there. Maybe like we have some sort of like infrastructure system where it's built up to a certain point.
Like 70. That would be
like, it's
that would
oddly
be
specific.
that would be amazing if like, you know, I think if that is true, the miraculous piece of that would be that that cutoff isn't something more arbitrary like 76.385 miles per hour.
Right.
It's very nicely rounded off to 75.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would guess it's just some arbitrary thing, and then it was good enough for some purposes. I mean, so somewhat we had that article earlier about the size of a virus, all that Wired article about what's an aerosol and what's a droplet and all that stuff. And that was somewhat arbitrary. And
yeah,
Brandon was talking earlier about deciding what size militarized conflict is a war. You said there's 25 threshold, and there's the 1,000. And yeah, so I don't know. So probably it's not worth, well, I shouldn't say worth, but it's very difficult to figure out those close cases. And that there's just a need to simplify the world. But
yeah, if I could just interrupt one other example of this, does anybody know how many people died in the Falkland Islands War? It was like 990 something.
Yeah.
So if our cutoff is 1,000, that doesn't count as a war. Should it?
So if I may, and if people want us to stop, I think we probably should come up on a break soon for whatever reason. But I realized I meandered. I didn't finish the Hein-Goemann's point.
Oh, yeah.
One of his thing, he does war, I'm sure, as you know better than me, I'm sure, is this stuff about war termination. So, and as a political psychologist, I'm going to hold on to this betrayal thing. Just, I think that does. So, but to make that a testable hypothesis, I'm wondering if some of this stuff like atrocities and going past the point of diminishing returns or something like that isn't more common in civil wars, because we do have a framework for interstate wars ending, and everybody has a place to live afterwards, right? The French go back to France, the Germans go back to Germany. Maybe we have to, move around the border a little bit, and then that's upsetting, and that's causes later problems often. But that's not a solution that's available to rebels to the same deal or to the leaders. So I'm wondering if the Hein tracks what kills leaders, and I suspect that they get killed more often for losing civil wars than for losing interstate wars. I mean, they might lose the office, but the idea that you could lose against another state and that we don't have to kill you for it, I think is just more. So then the leaders' incentives, this is something you can actually grab onto then.
Yeah.
Is that the leaders, like once you start the Civil War, I don't know, maybe the thinking is, if I don't win this, I'm going to die. Whereas an interstate war, I mean, you think about, to the degree that we didn't win Vietnam, the personal, like physical effects for our leadership was not that large, right? We didn't haul somebody off. So that's my
I think you're definitely onto something. I'll say this: there's been work that is built off of this kind of leader incentives culpability, so there's an argument about gambling for resurrection, for example, that is similar to kind of Hein-Goemann's arguments about leadership survival. So I'll say a few things. First, if a dictator loses an interstate war, they also are probably going to die. The second thing is, remember too that sometimes rebel leaders will fight on And then as long as they can get like a good peace deal where they get to be part of government or something, a power sharing arrangement, now they're happy again. Or they set up some arrangement where they can go into exile, right? This does happen too. But the bigger picture phenomenon I think that you're talking about too is this idea that, you know, maybe the stakes are higher. Maybe the stakes are higher for rebel leaders. And what that suggests, so one thing is, I will say that professor actually at UIUC named Alyssa Prorock, she has done these studies about do rebel leaders use this kind of gambling for resurrection kind of logic too. So basically the leaders that like started the conflict, right? Are they going to be more likely to kind of keep fighting to the end as opposed to accept a peace deal, which is what we have found in the interstate war literature too. And in fact, she does find the same kind of patterns. And so again, we're kind of finding similar patterns between these two types of wars, right? And you know, I think your points about betrayal too are super insightful. And you know, there has been a lot of foundational work on, for example, violence against civilians that has integrated those kinds of insights, right? Like, why do people kill other civilians, especially during war? And, you know, Stathis Kalivas has this foundational work about kind of information problems and all this kind of stuff, but there is a story about revenge there too. And I'll also note, just as a final kind of thing too, that the you know, the paper I was just talking about that I have under review after getting an R&R on this about right-wing populism and international conflict. The part of this idea is that, you know, the kind of rhetoric that right-wing populists use oftentimes is hyper-nationalist, and it appeals to revenge kind of politics and revenge type of sentiments, and that gets people riled up, right? And then they support the use of force. And then in democracies, then these leaders have to actually follow through with that. That's kind of our argument. And we do some survey experiments too, and we find that this is kind of the pattern that hold not just in the US, but in India and Japan is where we did it, right? And so that kind of rhetoric can kind of get people motivated for violence. That was an interstate conflict situation. I haven't replicated this in a civil war setting, but maybe I should.